Hello, I'm Sarit Dutta. I'm a postdoc in Professor Charles Singh's group at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And in this talk, I will discuss some of our ongoing work on understanding the dynamics and rheology of dilute bottlebrush polymers. Bottle brushes are a fairly new class of highly branched polymers. They consist of a linear chain shown here in red, which acts as a backbone, onto which numerous side chains are densely grafted. This dense grafting of the side chains introduces considerable steric hindrance, which forces these molecules to adopt a more extended conformation compared to, say, a linear chain. Steric hindrance also increases the molecular bending rigidity, which in melt state leads to drastically lower entanglements and facilitates rapid self-assembly and microphase separation in polymer bottle brushes. While we are within the bottle brush architecture, it is possible to introduce variations in the chemistry to obtain homopolymer bottle brushes, core shell, and polymer bottle brushes as well. Bottle brushes have been investigated by many different groups for a variety of different applications. For example, Sergei Shaiko and co-workers have developed ultrasoft elastomers by cross-linking bottle brushes for applications in artificial muscle tissue generation. And Bob Grubbs and co-workers have self-assembled die block bottle brushes in melt state to obtain photonic crystals. At Illinois, we are particularly interested in the self-assembly of polymer bottle brushes in the solution phase, where the self-assembly process is driven by an externally imposed flow field. Upon self-assembly, polymer bottle brushes phase separate into microdomains, which can interact with visible light to generate what are known as structural colors. There are many examples of such pigment-free coloration in nature, like in wings of butterflies, chameleons, and feathers of certain birds. We are collaborating with several experimental groups in Illinois, Simon Rogers, Ying Diao, and Damien Girone, to gain a deeper understanding of how bottle brushes self-assemble and what's the mechanism for generation of these structural colors. Recent work from the Rogers group have shown that shearing die block bottle brushes, which were synthesized in the Girone lab, at different shear rates can lead to a wide variety of visible structural colors. Going even further, Ying Diao's group has shown that it is possible to tune the structural colors on the fly while one is processing the material. A beautiful demonstration of their capabilities. Here is a pattern printed using solution printing in the shape of a chameleon, where using the flow rate as well as the temperature in a 3D solution printing device, they were able to generate a variety of colors using the same die block bottle brush sample, also synthesized in Damien Girone's group. On the simulation side, we are motivated by these experiments to seek an mechanistic understanding of the molecular level picture governing the self-assembly, as well as the effect of flow on determining the self-assembled microstructure and generation of structural color. While these experiments are done in fairly complicated environments for flow as well as in terms of concentration, on the simulation side, we would like to start at very, very simple situations. In particular, we are interested in looking at dilute solutions of homopolymer bottle brushes, and we are interested in understanding what the dynamics and rheology of these systems are. So in this talk, I will focus solely on some equilibrium properties as well as in uniaxial extension flow of homopolymer bottle brushes in dilute solution. I want to talk a little bit about the models. We use a fairly standard model. There's a bunch of beads connected by springs. There's NBB beads on the backbone and NSC beads on each side chain. There's a single side chain for every backbone repeat unit, as is the same in case of the chemistry of molecule synthesized in the Girone lab. The bond potential is stiff Finney springs, and this purely repulsive pair potential between the beads. For gaining insight into equilibrium conformations, we performed Monte Carlo simulations using standard moves like crankshaft, backbone pivot, and sidechain double bridging. And we were able to calculate some of the transport properties at equilibrium using Kirkwood-based formulas. Here's a couple of snapshots at equilibrium of bottle brushes. We can see here that even qualitatively, the bottle brushes look fairly swollen, and they look like they have a clearly they have some bending rigidity compared to a linear chain if I just remove the side chains. The second thing to note is that there is a large number of beads in these molecules. So if I am to model these bottle brushes, I would require a much larger number of particles compared to say if I were just doing a linear chain. And for flow, we used standard Brownian dynamic simulations. We have an imposed flow, which is purely uniaxial extension for all purposes of this talk. There's hydrodynamic interactions entering via the RPY tensor, and the square root of the diffusivity matrix is calculated by a recently proposed Krylov subspace method. We compared our simulation predictions with some experimental measurements performed in Simon Rogers' lab on samples synthesized by Damien Gironet's group. Here's a plot of intrinsic viscosity with molecular weight for linear polymers as well as two different series of bottle brushes. I'll point out that the agreement between the simulation predictions and the experimental measurements is very good, and there is for both simulations and experiments we can see that there is a low molecular plateau and a high molecular weight scaling regime. These two regimes reflect the shape of the bottle brush. In this low molecular weight, the bottle brush's backbone is fairly short compared to its side chain. So overall, it looks close to a rod star. And as the backbone length increases, this approaches a more coil-like scaling regime. And this picture is consistent with the asymptotic approach to this scaling regime. The last thing I want to say about things in equilibrium is that at equilibrium the molecules are much swollen. We look at the gyration radius and its scaling exponent as a function of backbone length and side chain length as well. Compared to a scaling exponent of 1.18 for linear chains, we find that the exponent is much larger, 1.4, for bottle brushes. However, this is still not in the rod regime, which would have been 1.2. So while the bottle brushes are swollen, they are not as stiff at this grafting density as a rigid rod. The side chains are also stretched, as we can see from the gyration radius of side chains plotted against its length. And the scaling exponent is 1.28, which is still swollen, but it is less than that of the whole bottle brush. We explored a variety of other equilibrium properties in our recent paper, and if you're interested in equilibrium shape and size of these bottle brushes, you can check this out. Next, I want to just jump into uniaxial extensional flow. For these cases, we decided to hold the number of backbone beads constant to 120, and we vary the number of side chain beads from 2 to 20. The grafting density, as before, is one side chain per backbone monomer. And based on NBB and NSC, it is possible to define a nominal aspect ratio which goes from 3 to 40 for our cases. And the key question we are asking is, what happens when we take a linear chain and start adding side chains to it? What's the effect of the presence of the side chains on the dynamics as well as the rheological properties for bottle brushes? And before moving on, I wanted to give you a qualitative picture of how things look like in extensional flow for both a linear chain and a bottle brush, both at Weissenberg number 50. So here's how the linear chain stretches out in an extensional flow. And here's how a bottle brush stretches out. Just by looking at the animations, you can see that the dynamics for bottle brushes are much more sluggish, and while the backbone stretches out, so does the side chains. And there's a difference in the side chains in the center part versus the ones towards the end, which not only do they stretch out, they also align. And there's a difference, of course, in the time scales between these two. Between the rate at which the side chain versus the bottle brush stretches out, but more on that later. Okay, the first question we had is that when we start up an extensional flow, is there any qualitative difference between a bottle brush stretching out at a fixed side chain length versus a linear chain stretching out? Note that here I'm not looking at exactly the numbers, I'm just looking at is there any qualitative change in the behavior? And the answer is no. We looked at the first normal stress difference, the backbone fractional extension, as well as extensional viscosity versus strain for different Weisenberg numbers for NSC8. And we see that both the normal stress and the fractional extension increases with increase of Weisenberg number. This increase is monotonic, and this this kind of behavior is well known for linear polymers. So we do not investigate this point any further, and we start varying the side chain length and look at what happens under flow. Here's again first normal stress difference and fractional extension, but in this case we are varying the NSC, that is the number of beads on the side chain, while holding the Weisenberg number fixed at 50. Note that here two different regimes clearly emerges when the total strain, the Henke strain is low. The fractional extension as well as the first normal stress difference increases with increasing NSC, while for longer times, that is when the strain is large enough, the trend reverses. It is instructive to look at the conformations at low strain versus high strains. At low strains, the bottle brushes are fairly close to their equilibrium conformation, which I earlier showed that they are fairly swollen compared to a linear chain. But when sufficiently strained, both bottle brushes and linear chains, they completely stretch out, given that this is a fairly strong flow at Weisenberg number 50. But the side chains have a role to play here, which you will see will lead to lowering of the fractional extension. It is more illustrative to look at the whole range of Weisenberg numbers, but in this case at steady state. And again, we see here two different regimes. There is a regime for high Weisenberg number, and there is one for low Weisenberg number. At high Weisenberg number, the stress as well as the fractional extension is higher for linear chains compared to that of bottle brushes. And I'll point out here that in case of bottle brushes, the bulk of the entire stress is carried by the backbone connectors and not by the side chain connectors or by excluded volume interactions. While in the case of low Weisenberg number, bottle brushes have a higher fractional extension. Bottle brushes have a higher fractional extension as well as a higher stress. There are not too many points in this low Weisenberg number region, but we are in the process of getting more data here. But in mind's eye, you can extrapolate these values, and you can see that they have to reach their equilibrium value, which is larger for bottle brushes. Okay, we rationalize these observations by noting that at equilibrium, bottle brushes are larger than linear chains, so the fractional extension has to be larger. While as the bottle brushes stretches out in stronger flows, the hydrodynamic screening due to the presence of the side chains lowers the fractional extension of the backbone, because lowering screening of hydrodynamic interaction leads to screening of a hydrodynamic drag, and hence there is less stress on the backbone compared to that of the case in which there were no side chains. And that rationalizes the observation that fractional extension for bottle brushes is lower than that of linear chains. Okay, so far I talked about the overall molecule and the backbone. What about the side chains? Here's a snapshot of a stretched out bottle brush at very high flow, Weisenberg number 100. Note that the side chains are completely stretched out and aligned in the flow direction. Flow direction is X, let me remind you, Y and Z are compression directions towards the ends. While toward the middle, the side chains, they are stretched out, but they are not necessarily completely aligned in the flow direction. Here I'm showing the extension of the side chains compared to their equilibrium value as a function of a Weisenberg number. This Weisenberg number is based on that of the whole molecule. And we note that the stretching of the side chains does not start at Weisenberg number 1. Rather, it takes quite a higher values of Weisenberg number for them to show visible stretching. And that this stretching increases with increasing the side chain length. Another thing to note is, what about the alignment? Alignment indirectly of the side chains indirectly shows up in the span of the backbone, that is in the Y direction. That means if we think of this as a bottle brush thickness, as the side chains align, the overall bottle brush thickness goes down, as you can see in this plot, and this also increases the aspect ratio of the bottle brushes. So this is commensurate with the idea that as the molecule stretches out, it gets compressed and it gets thinner. Okay, with that, I would like to summarize and conclude by saying that, excuse me, saying that we used a bead spring model parameterized for experimental data for our experimental data for polynorborane and polylactic acid side chains to study the dynamics and rheology of dilute bottle brushes. And we find very good agreement between simulations and experiments in equilibrium. Moving on to flow, we see that there's competition between the equilibrium size and the flow-induced reduction of drag due to hydrodynamic screening from the side chain, which results in two clearly distinct regimes. One in which at low Weisenberg numbers, the fractional extension as well as the normal stress is higher for the bottle brushes compared to linear chains, while it is lower for higher Weisenberg numbers in case of both fractional extension and normal stresses. We are continuing some calculations on getting data for shear flow in dilute solutions, and in future we intend to extend our studies to semi-dilute and more concentrated solutions to get closer to the experimental results for self-assembly and generation of structural color. I'd like to thank the National Science Foundation for funding this work and other members of the SING group. And finally, we did some recent work on understanding equilibrium self-assembly for die blocks using coarse-grained models. And if you are interested more in this work, please check out this talk, which will be delivered by my advisor, Professor Charles Singh. And thank you for listening.